Yo, Nakama, welcome back to the third episode of our beginner's guide to the One Piece card game. Now, in episode 1, we covered the keywords, card types, everything that you need to understand how to read a One Piece card. The second episode, we went over how to place your cards on the mat and what the specific turn order and turn phases were. Now, we're going to go into something that's a little bit more complicated. It's how to build your first deck. So in this one, we're going to go through everything that comes with building a deck and going over how to do this as efficiently and effectively as possible with what I have learned and experienced. So let's go ahead and run that intro, and I'll catch you guys in a second. Peace and love, y'all. All right, guys, I do want to start with a common/disclaimer to this entire video. And that disclaimer is that there is no universal way to build a One Piece deck in general. Now, what I want to kind of go over is that it completely applies to your leader. So your leader is your core template that you want to use when building your One Piece deck. Now, two decks can be the exact same color, but do completely different things depending on their leader effect. That's actually what makes One Piece one of the best card games out there right now, because it means that you just can't memorize a template or memorize a formula pattern and just stick it on there. And so what I've done is I've kind of taken that rigid formula and I've put them into 3 specific buckets. The first one is your core. This is the actual game plan you're building towards when it comes to your deck. Next is your counters, which is your defensive fuel to drive the engine of your deck. And then lastly are your tech cards. This answers specific matchups that you may be experiencing or what the meta has defined as these are the most popular decks to play when it comes to the One Piece card game. And everything you put in your deck should fall in line to one of these 3 buckets. Now, if a card doesn't clearly belong in one of them, it's usually a sign that it doesn't belong in the deck yet, or is such a valuable card that it needs to be played in the deck because it holds multiple functions. Before you even touch counters and tech cards, you need a game plan. And a game plan that almost always starts with 1 or 2 specific cards. I like to call these your anchor cards. Please make sure you like and subscribe for dad jokes everywhere.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
So, what is an anchor card? So, an anchor isn't just the biggest, most expensive card in your deck. It's the card your entire strategy is built around. Sometimes there's a huge top-end bomb. Sometimes it's a 4-cost card that comes down early and just does all of the work the entire game. The size of the card does not matter. What matters is whether your deck is designed to make that card as strong as possible. As a beginner's tip, pick 1 anchor to start. Not 3, not 5, 1. Trying to build around multiple game plans at once is exactly how new players end up with 80 card piles that they just can't cut down because they feel all of them are anchor cards. Now, you start narrow, you build outward, and add complexity later once you actually start understanding how your deck operates. Once you've picked your anchor, ask, what supports this card? What gets me to the turn I play it consistently? What do I want on board before and after it comes down? All of that is your core of the deck. Now, if you don't know the full card pool yet, you don't try to read every single card that's ever been printed. That is way too much time, too much effort, and too much of your sanity. So instead, use an official deck builder or a browser tool. You select your leader and filter by character types your leader cares about. What I like to use is gumgum.gg for this particular list because it gives me that filter automatically. So most support packages are designed to stay thematically together. So this alone will cut thousands of hours, thousands of cards to look at, and give you something that's more of a manageable. Every deck learns somewhere on a spectrum between full aggression and full control. Knowing where your deck sits helps you evaluate every card you're considering. Aggressive decks want to close the game fast, often before their opponent stabilizes. Control decks want to run the opponent out of resources and win on their own terms later in the game. Most cards have a lane spectrum as well. So what that means is that some are pure pressure, and some are pure defensive tools that help you kind of get into the game and stabilize later on. And then some cards do a little bit of both, depending on what they exactly do based on their effects, as well as thematically what they do within the deck. So once you get your deck mastered and you understand how the deck is supposed to operate and supposed to work, you can actually look for cards that live in that same lane instead of just grabbing generically good cards that really don't support your game plan. And here is the common mistake that a lot of players make, especially new players. Don't obsess over curving out perfectly every single turn. The Dawn system of this game is very forgiving, and you don't need to hit every turn on curve in order to stay competitive. Focus on your game, focus on what your matchups are, and then curve considerations come later during the refinement stage of your deck building process. Now, counter is the number of counter on the character card, whether it's plus 1,000, plus 2,000, or even in events that say plus 3,000 or even plus 4,000 in some cases. Whatever it says, that is the counter that you need in order to apply additional defensive pressure when it comes to the One Piece card game. Now, there are cards that have no counter listed. This is what we like to commonly call a brick in hand. Bricks are powerful cards, but too many of them is a real problem in your deck. You'll find yourself stuck holding a bunch of bricks in hand and losing the game because of it. Because there is nothing to defend with when you have a brick in hand. There is no magic number here, since it depends entirely on your leader and how it interacts with your hand and supposed to how to interact with your opponent's board. Some leaders want very few bricks in their deck. Others can get away with a ton of bricks in the deck because the leader effect gives them another way to generate defense. A good example of this is OP13's Red Blue Ace with their leader ability to discard a card to give something minus 2,000 power for the battle. For 2,000 counter cards specifically, there is a reasonable starting point for most decks to have, and that's somewhere between 8 to 12 copies, and then you can adjust from there depending on how your matchups go and just actually practicing the deck. If you feel you don't have enough, you add some more. If you feel like you're seeing all kinds of 2Ks and you're not really seeing any of your mid-game or late-game bombs, cut those back to replace them. Now, the takeaway from this is that if you are noticing in hand that you have a lot of 2Ks, that's the easy part. The easiest part, though, is that you can actually see how many bricks you have in hand just by visually seeing what it looks like, right? And so if you are noticing visually that you have a ton of bricks or you don't have enough counter in hand, this is also the very big telltale sign that you need to add more 2Ks or even just more counter in general to your deck list. Once your core and your counter base are set, you'll have some room left in the deck. Usually somewhere between 8 to 10 cards is kind of where I figure when I do my deck builds. And this is where your tech cards really come into play. Now, a tech card's whole purpose is to exploit a specific weakness in a specific matchup or a specific trend in the current meta. So think of it like this. The meta is full of X. So I'm bringing in a card that answers X. Now the catch is tech cards only work if the timing lines up exactly. A great answer to a problem is useless if it comes online 2 turns after the problem is already on board and beating you. So this category requires the most testing and the most willingness to swap things in and out as the meta shifts. Once you've got your rough 50, the next question is, how many copies of each card do I need to run? Here's a simple framework to start with. Now keep in mind, this is not a hard rule, but just a baseline. You want to see this card as often as possible? You run it as a 4 of. You want to see it at least once per game? You usually run it as a 3 of. It's nice to have, but you don't want to draw multiple copies of it. You run it as a 2 of. Typically, this is when you would put your tech card slot into as a 2 of. Now, a situational or high impact single copy, this is a 1 of. But be careful with these early on. Too many 1 ofs make your deck extremely inconsistent and harder to pilot as a beginner. And so when in doubt, you would cut the 1 of and bump something else to a 4 of. Now, when you're unsure of whether to run something as a 3 or a 4 of, I would like to typically do what's called the flip card test method. This is when you would typically flip a card upside down in its sleeve during testing, never in an actual tournament. So when you draw it, you would ask yourself, would I rather this be the card I flipped or something else? I would do this across enough times to test out whether or not you want to see the answer. And through enough testing games, you'll know when that answer becomes very obvious. So to recap the framework, first, pick your anchor and build your core around it. Second, know where your deck sits on the aggro control spectrum. Set your counter base and adjust through testing. Fill the remaining slots with tech cards for the current meta, and then refine your ratios and use that flip card method to fine-tune your deck. Now, this isn't a one note and one and done type of process, right? Every deck gets rebuilt and rebalanced as you play it and as the meta shifts around you. That is deck building in of itself. Now, next episode in the Beginner's Guide, we're going to go over a couple of other things, such as mulligan decisions and life card mechanics and hand management. So if this really did help you, let me know by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing that notification bell so that way I can continue doing these types of uploads, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace and love, y'all.
Thanks for riding with the vibe. K0zzee Games every time. Pulling leaders, making plays on the line. Sailing through the grand line, strategy refined. Catch your next match, stay locked in the grind.